Hello, and welcome to the Why We Argue podcast. I'm Robert Talisse, your host. I'm professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Why We Argue is produced by Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a project based at the University of Connecticut, which explores how to balance our deepest commitments with open-mindedness, a respect for reason, and intellectual humility. The series, which is made possible by generous funding from the John Templeton Foundation, features brief discussions with publicly minded thinkers about the state of civil discourse in contemporary democracy. Now today, my guest is Kevin Levin. Kevin is a public historian who specializes in the history of the Civil War. He has special interests in historical memory. He holds positions with the National Humanities Center and with the National Council for History Education. He's also a frequent contributor to publications like The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, The New York Times, and the Smithsonian. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, Rob. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Oh, it's good to talk to you, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So let's get to it. You recently wrote an essay for The Atlantic, this is just a few weeks ago, and the title is Why I Changed My Mind About Confederate Monuments. It seems like a good place to begin, given the nature of the Why We Argue podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about this piece that you wrote?
Yeah, absolutely. That piece came out shortly after, a couple days after, the violent rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, involving a number of white nationalists who marched through the University of Virginia on a Friday evening, and the next day rallied around the Robert E. Lee Monument in what is now called Emancipation Park. I lived in Charlottesville for over 10 years, taught there, used those monuments throughout my teaching career to sort of talk to my students about not just the history of the Civil War, but also the time period in which many of these monuments, including the Robert E. Lee and the Stonewall Jackson Monument, which is a few blocks away, were erected and dedicated. And we're talking about, in reference to most Confederate monuments, we're talking about the period roughly between 1890 and 1940. So we're talking about the height of the Jim Crow era, a period of segregation, racial segregation. And the monuments, for most historians who study this, the monuments reflect a kind of a white supremacist view of the Civil War. It certainly doesn't take into consideration how African Americans who lived in these communities would have remembered or would have commemorated the Civil War era. And so I guess for most of my career, my approach to monuments had always been as an educator and as a historian. So I guess you could say I approached them as relics that needed to be interpreted to help us understand some of the more difficult moments in American history, namely the Jim Crow era. And so if you would have asked me, say, 10 years ago, what is your position on these monuments, I probably would have resisted flat out removing them because I think they play such an important role for communities, the communities in which they are a presence. But I think in the last few years, and I guess I would point to the shootings in Charleston in the summer of 2015, that proved to be sort of a decisive moment for me, as well as a visit to Prague in Czechoslovakia that same summer. I started listening a lot more to people on the ground in some of these communities, people who lived with these monuments on a day-to-day basis. And I opened my ears a bit more to sort of the emotional or psychological aspect of what it means to live, close by, having to look up at a Robert E. Lee monument or a Jefferson Davis statue, and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think sort of in the last few years, sort of opening myself up a bit more to, again, that other aspect of the life of these monuments, the impact they have on real people's daily lives. That's certainly shaped how I see monuments. I'm at the point now where I think it's safe to say I'm much more comfortable with the removal of some of these monuments. That is not to say that I won't continue to use monuments and statues as a teaching tool, but I'm much more, I think, tuned into why some people, specifically African Americans, are so troubled by their presence. And I think those are the voices that deserve to be heard more than the kinds of concerns expressed by my fellow public historians, more on the lines of preservation and education.
Sure. So, can you speak a little bit to what is often the pushback from the other side? And we even heard a version of this from our president, that the
Yeah,
removal of public monuments that are related to this dark period of the nation's history, but the removal of the
yeah,
monuments is somehow an attack on historical truth or historical memory, or it's somehow washing away or removing
yeah.
some fact about our collective past. I've never myself I have to admit, again, I'm not a historian, obviously. I've never myself understood that what's being asserted in that line. Do
Yeah.
you have a better sense of what the concern is there?
Yeah, I think the president, whether he whether he realized it, whether he was conscious of it or not, I think what his comments reflected is what you might call a sort of a heritage attitude toward American history, and the Civil War or the history of the Confederacy specifically is often sort of reduced to just another moment in American history where Americans sort of braved the battlefield to fight for their respective values, as opposed to their northern neighbors who fought for their respective values. But in the end, by the turn of the 20th century, Americans on both sides, North and South, were willing to sort of look beyond the cause for which both sides fought. And that meant, to a great extent, ignoring the divisive issues of slavery and emancipation from the national memory or national narrative of the war. And I think President Trump's remarks sort of reflect this tendency to equate the Confederacy with just they were also Americans, right? And it dismisses or it minimizes, I think, what more and more Americans are acknowledging in the last few years, and that is that these men fought for a government whose purpose, and they didn't hide this from anyone, they were very explicit about this, was the creation of an independent slaveholding republic based on white supremacy. But because Lee, Jackson, and these other figures have become kind of iconic American military men, it's I think for some people much more difficult to sort of step back and acknowledge the cause for which they fought. And I think Trump was also speaking to a certain base that is eager to rally around these monuments, not because they are interested necessarily in history, but because these monuments are wrapped up in politics itself. And that's what makes this so difficult, I think, to sort of really sink your teeth into, because so much of the public discourse is not so much about history. It's about sort of the broader cultural, political, and racial divide. And the monuments become a kind of rallying point around which to sort of engage in these discussions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, just one thing that you said is comes as a an insight to me that I'm sure I'm just late to the game on this. But I suppose that, or would you say it's right to say that the part of what the Confederate monuments' purpose was in erecting them was to change the public perception of
Mm-hmm.
figures like Lee, so that they would become recognized as American, as you say, military men. They're
Yeah.
generals.
Right.
And I'm just thinking of what the monuments look like.
Yeah.
And that's how the leaders of the Confederacy are portrayed, just as courageous soldiers or
That's right.
men with integrity fighting for what they believe in,
That's right.
so that the sort of mythology around the Civil War that you're pointing to, which downplays the actual causes and doesn't make reference to the Confederacy as a treasonous, traitorous secessionist movement,
Right.
but
Right.
rather presents these people as just upright, soldiers.
That's right.
That it feeds. It's sort of like it's a self-perpetuating kind of imagery.
Right.
Does that sound right?
That's right. That served a specific purpose at the turn of the 20th century. It helped white Southerners deal with the fact of defeat. It helped them sort of move from the devastation that the Civil War wrought. And at a time, decades later, when the South itself was in transition, where people are calling for the South to become more industrialized, at a point when Confederate veterans are beginning to die off, and a younger generation that never experienced the war directly, they become a way to sort of unify this new generation around a memory of the war in order to deal with some of the confusion, racial unrest, and uncertainty of the future, especially as you get into the 20th century, close to World War I. These monuments are kind of a reminder of a more gallant time, and one that can still be embraced, can still bring collective meaning moving into the future.
And do you think that one might say, given the account you just gave, that for that generation of white people living in the South after the Civil War, the monuments as they were erected
Mm-hmm.
may have played a kind of therapeutic role?
Oh, absolutely.
And so, but I guess now part of the argument uh, on the side of the people who would favor their removal, at least the removal of many of them, has to do that the meaning of those monuments can change now that the therapeutic need is not quite
Yeah.
what it was. Does that sound right?
I think that's right. I think even among white Southerners, certainly as we move further and further from the Civil War generation, and and of course people are moving into the South. We're moving all the time. There's demographic shifts that play a really crucial role here in the last few decades. That people don't have the same personal attachment to these monuments that their parents or grandparents would have had, and that has a lot to do with how the subject is being taught now more and more in schools, public and private schools around the country, and a host of other factors. So for white Southerners, certainly you can find a kind of a split that you would not have found over the meaning of the war and the monuments a few decades ago. I think for African Americans, I don't think much has changed in terms of how they view these monuments. I
Right.
think you can go back to the time in which these were dedicated. Take, for instance, the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, 1890, 120,000 people showed up for its dedication. And the editor of a black newspaper in the city, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, he said, the black man was there to help put up this monument. And when the time comes, he will be there to pull it down.
Right.
So that kind of, and that of course speaks to the fact that African Americans simply were not involved in these discussions about how their tax dollars and how their communities would remember these monuments. But I'll add one more point here. I think for the diehards, if you will, the white Southerners who are really holding tight to this traditional view of the monuments, that creates a lot of challenges in terms of how to engage them in public debate. And I would perhaps go as far as to say it makes it close to impossible, because what they're coming at it with is what they take to be a kind of a personal, familial connection, ancestral connection to the past, and they're extrapolating from that to generalize about the war from that kind of personal connection. And I can't think of another area of history where people approach it from such a personal perspective and then draw conclusions about the history as a whole. Most people don't have that kind of emotional connection. They're more than willing to sort of place their own, ancestry within a framework provided by historians and others, if that makes sense.
No, that makes good sense and provides a nice segue. So part of your work as a public historian, and in fact, on your webpage, part of what you describe as that work is outreach and interest in helping others, share your passion for the history of the nation. So I take it that you engage online quite a bit. in discussions about not only sort of factual historical materials with respect to the Civil War, but also these broader questions that you were just touching on, the
Yeah.
nature of historical memory, the place of that kind of memory in forging our sense of identity and our sense of place. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of your outreach and some of the challenges that it presents?
Yeah, I've been blogging for it's going on 11 years now, and I
Wow.
started at a time when few people were blogging, seriously about history. It does present a number of challenges because when you're blogging about something like Civil War memory, not just history but the memory, for the reasons I just mentioned a few moments ago, that can be a very difficult sell for some people, especially those I just described who really are resistant to what they see as encroachment on their territory, right? So I'm quite often, I get the references of the liberal academic, the revisionist, and much worse. I won't share some of that with your guests.
And being from the North, I guess, doesn't
That
help.
doesn't help. Being Jewish doesn't help.
Right.
So I have a number of strikes against me right off the bat. But what I found, and I don't mean just in terms of blogging, but also in terms of other examples of public outreach, whether it's public talks or even the kind of writing that I most enjoy, I find more often than not that people are willing to engage, that they are willing to put some of their assumptions, in check, consider new questions. That, of course, I approach this as an educator in that regard. I see it more as an extension of my classroom, even though I'm not teaching specifically right now. And so in that sense, it's a very rewarding kind of way to do history because, of course, I do try to engage in scholarship. But the work that means the most to me is actually working with the public, and that's, of course, certainly picked up in the last just a few months, given this current debate over the monuments.
Excellent. Does the but a lot of other guests on the program in previous episodes who engage in sort of public outreach of the kind that you're describing
Mm.
have reported confronting in some of the more adversarial encounters,
Yeah.
let's call them, not only just the kind of unpleasantness that you were describing a moment ago, but also interlocutors who have a suspicious set of attitudes about the very nature of expertise.
Sure.
So, do you confront that?
Yeah, I think it comes out in sort of the ways I described. I just finished, reading Tom Nichols's new book about sort of the death of expertise, as he's called it, and I can certainly see some of that in the work that I do. Specifically, I think of all things, with the rise of the internet, that has become, I think, the biggest challenge because it's both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, we have access to an incredible amount of information at our fingertips, and yet we're not really teaching. We're not teaching students, and we're not even teaching teachers how to intelligently, search the internet and assess the information that our search engines are providing. And that, I think, is a challenge for the idea of any notion of gatekeepers, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think academic historians specifically have traditionally seen themselves as sort of playing the role of a gatekeeper, right? Sort of assessing new interpretations that come down the road. And of course, you see that in other fields as well. But with the internet has democratized the study of history. Anyone can be a historian now, right? You can set up your own website. It's easy to cut and paste information from one website to the next. And I think that's one example in which this sort of public discourse has become muddied, very confusing. Myths, of course, are very easy to spread on the internet as a result. So the notion of gatekeepers, I would suggest they simply don't exist anymore. Or expertise, how do you define it? in this environment, I think, is extremely difficult now.
Right, right, right. So you just mentioned something that I think makes a nice occasion for discussing another part of your work, because in addition to the public history work that you do and the outreach that you do, you are the producer of academic scholarship, and so you've published one book already about the Battle of the Crater, and you have a current project that you're hoping to finish very soon, as you told me before we started the recording. So I know that your time is precious. But so your current book project is about something that you call the Civil War's most persistent myth. Can you tell us a little bit about the myth and what the project is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is actually called "Searching for Black Confederate Soldiers," and then the subtitle is what you just referenced. If you were to go to the internet right now, go to Google, the search page, and type in Black Confederate or Black Confederates, you would. My guess is you would come away with hundreds, if not thousands, of websites, and many of these websites you'll find images of African American men in Confederate uniforms. You might even find personal accounts of these men serving as soldiers in the Confederate Army. You might even find an image of a group of Confederate soldiers standing next to two officers that is often referenced as Louisiana soldiers serving in the Confederacy. And all of this is a myth. It's a myth that, as far as I can tell, was first, you can find its origins in the late 1970s in direct opposition to a sort of a shift in popular memory or public memory, if you will, about the Civil War. At a time when more and more Americans are coming to sort of accept that slavery was central to the war, its cause, that emancipation was one of its most important results. This is after decades of Americans really not wanting to deal with the cause, as I had mentioned earlier. And at a time when stories of black Union soldiers, roughly 200,000 free and formerly enslaved black men who fought in the United States Army to save the Union and end slavery. And by the 1970s, there's a group called the Sons of Confederate Veterans that is growing more and more concerned about the popularity of this narrative. And their response is to sort of start talking about their own so-called Black Confederate soldiers. And for the first few years, really all they could produce was, magazines and, small print books about this. But it was with the advent of the internet that this really took off. And by the early 2000s, it had become a dominant narrative on the internet specifically. And it speaks to, again, the fact that we're not teaching, students how to properly, access and assess information online. And, it's created all kinds of problems. In 2009, a Virginia textbook, a fourth grade textbook for public schools, included a reference to thousands of black men fighting under Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. And it was later learned that the author had simply conducted a basic Google search, and she had come across the first website, and she had basically assumed the information was correct, and it ended up in a book for children. So we have books that are being read in our public schools. It's appeared in Hollywood movies. Even the National Park Service has fallen victim to it. It's from my purposes as someone who spends so much time online, writing and engaging with people. It's proven to be probably the best example of the pitfalls of doing history, of trying to be a historian in the age of the internet.
And so, just to be clear, so the myth of the Black Confederate soldier was what you're saying is that this is something that emerges in the 70s as a way of countering the view that is now or widely accepted, maybe in every place except the internet, that one of the causes of the war
Right.
is slavery and one of its outcomes was emancipation. Because I take it that the thought is that pro-Confederacy contemporaries think that if they could show that there were African American soldiers fighting on the side of the Confederacy, that shows that the end of slavery was not what the war was about. Is that the thought?
That's right. That's excellent. That the Confederacy was not in fact fighting to preserve slavery, and that in fact that the Confederacy was just as responsible for ending slavery as the United States. So it's a way to sort of deal with the growing, sort of a more widely accepted view. The Confederacy was in fact fighting to preserve slavery, and so that's its purpose. And my book starts with the war itself. No one was confused about the place of African Americans who found themselves in the Confederate Army. They did all kinds of jobs in the military. But they were never considered soldiers, and it was only until the very last weeks of the war in 1865 in March that the Confederate government actually authorized their enlistment. But of course, by then only a few were able to enlist, and the war ended. But even through the early 20th century, it's very clear that these men who attended Confederate veterans reunions, they were written about extensively. You're hard-pressed to find any references to them at all as soldiers. They were slaves, or as they would have called them in many cases, their body servants in the Army. It's only in the 1970s that this really does kick into high gear, and then, of course, even more so, once the internet becomes, a factor.
And on the just again, pardon my ignorance on this. And on the internet, if I were to do the search that you're recommending, what are the vehicles of this myth? Certainly, it's not simply narratives. I mean, are there doctored documents? I mean, what exactly? What fuels the mythology here?
Yeah. So one of you mentioned a doctored documents. There is one example, and it's an image of it's a black and white image of a group of black soldiers in uniform. And it's clearly was taken in a studio, and because the uniforms look gray in the photograph, it is assumed that they were Confederate soldiers. It took two researchers from the University of Virginia to go back and connect it to a lithograph from 1864 that was done in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Camp William Penn. And these men, in fact, were Union soldiers, newly recruited black Union soldiers. But in 1973, the image first appeared in a Civil War magazine, and then it was later photoshopped. Not clear who photoshopped it. So that's probably one of the clearest examples of manipulation. But the damage is done because you can find that image on literally hundreds, if not thousands, of websites. But much of the rest of the kind of primary source information, newspaper references, personal correspondence, and some of what's called the official records of the War of the Rebellion, what you often find on websites are these accounts, but no context. So the people who organize these websites take it as sort of assumed that their preferred conclusion that these accounts actually show soldiers as opposed to slaves should be accepted by the visitor. And that, of course, is the danger here, because what you have are people who are clearly not able to provide any kind of analytical interpretation to these primary sources. They're simply not able to do it. And most people are not really looking for it, right? Mm-hmm. They believe what's presented to them. And because it's been reproduced on so many websites, that itself becomes kind of a confirmation for its veracity, right?
Sure.
And so, you end up in this sort of vicious cycle.
Well, Kevin, I really look forward to the book, and it will be a great read. And I'm saying this as somebody who I'm embarrassed to confess does not read many history books. But I know your time is precious, and given things that are going on in the country, you've got other interviews even on your schedule for this very day. So, Kevin Levin, thank you so much for talking with me today on the Why We Argue podcast.
My pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning into the podcast. Remember that the podcast is produced by the University of Connecticut's Humility and Conviction in Public Life Project with generous support from the John Templeton Foundation. Now, you can follow the project on Twitter and on Facebook at Public Humility, one word. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye now.